and hanging in there.
Me too.
And it's a pleasure to be able to come to you, even if it's on a computer screen, and be able to chat. I want to acknowledge the staff at Addison Reserve, and I think this is very thoughtful of them to want to make sure that they provide these kind of opportunities for all of you and for everyone. You know, ever since this crisis started, I have not liked the term social distancing. I think we should have called it physical distancing, because socially now more than ever, we all need to come together and support one another. And therefore, I'm just delighted to be able to do this, although I do miss the cookies at Addison Reserve. So, and I'm sure you do as well. Now, as always, I'm happy to take questions, so we can run them through the hosts, or there's a chat feature, and when we're done, you can type in on the line, and I'll be able to see the question and we'll answer it. So what I wanted to do today, I've had the great pleasure of being able to talk to you all several times. I wanted to avoid the usual difficulties of politics and interpretation, so I just wanted to do something basic. So I thought I'd talk about my hero, Harry Truman. So here's what I thought we'd do. I had a really, really cool experience many years ago. I tracked down all the living advisors to Harry Truman, you know, military, speechwriters, lawyers, secretaries, aides, tracked them all down over the course of a couple of years on behalf of the Truman Presidential Library. And I interviewed all of them extensively. Several of them I had multiple interviews with, and I recorded their stories for the Truman Library, so that, just like a Shoah project, an oral history for Holocaust survivors or World War II vets, I wanted to have these in the record for future generations. Only what I did, instead of talking about interest rates or inflation or things like that, I wanted to ask fun questions, like what was his favorite song? What did he play on the piano? What was his favorite joke? Did he ever make you laugh? Did he ever make you angry? Did he ever make you cry? What do you first remember when you met him? So what I did is I put together from these, you know, countless interviews and information, I put together my 10 favorite stories. So I thought that would be nice and light, but also insightful, because you learn a lot about the man, a lot about leadership, a lot about the office through these stories. So that's what I thought I'd do. That's what we'll do today. But before I jump into that, since I said what was Truman's favorite joke and what he liked to play on the piano, let me tell you what they told me. Because what I wanted to do is I wanted future generations that would watch these recordings that I made with the aides. I wanted them to know him as a person. So I didn't want to talk about interest rates and inflation. I wanted the good stuff. So he was a good pianist, as you're all probably aware, and he was from Missouri. He hated the Missouri Waltz. Yes, everywhere he went, people knew he was from Missouri and played the piano, so they wanted him to play the Missouri Waltz. He hated it, but he would smile good-naturedly and play the song for everybody. He liked Brahms. Truman loved classical music, so quite unusual for a farmer from rural Missouri. Nonetheless, there it is. His favorite joke, I had several aides tell me this. They said that Truman would always say, politics is the worst. It's the nastiest business, and it's so nasty you can almost forgive politicians for anything. So here, having understood that, here's his joke. He would always say, don't tell my mother I'm in politics, because she thinks I play the piano in a whorehouse. So being a whorehouse pianist was preferable to being a U.S. senator. So that was his joke. So just a quick bit about him. Truman was born in 1884. What's remarkable is he was born to, on both sides of the family, basically unreconstructed Confederates. His family was racist and anti-Semitic, which it's remarkable that this man becomes the person that he was. One of the many reasons why I like him is he shows us that you can teach an old dog new tricks. Truman outgrows his really narrow and hateful upbringing to be the champion of the global Jewish diaspora, to really be a champion of African Americans and promoting civil rights and human rights, healthcare and women's issues. So it's remarkable that he did all that. Relatedly, he would be the last American president to lack a college degree. I mean, go figure. The guy who is the architect of the post-war order lacked a college degree. Just a remarkable story, and I'll shed some more light on that in a moment. So when he grew up, he held a number of jobs. He worked as a farmer. He worked as at a railway as a time clerk. He worked at a bank as a teller. He invested in oil speculation, didn't make anything, went bankrupt, sold the drilling operation, and they found oil. Poor Harry. So he had a really rough upbringing. Rural Missouri, as I said, last president to lack a college degree. He had a couple of goals, however. He wanted to go to West Point and be a military officer. He also wanted to be an historian. Well, he's got to be good then, right? He wanted to be an historian and an architect. He would get a chance to do all of those, actually. He would get to play historian and architect when the White House had to be completely gutted, renovated, and restored. So when Truman was president, the White House was in a bad state. He used to always tell his aides, he would say, the building's haunted. Because when he would walk, he would hear it creaking and groaning. At night, you'd hear all these weird sounds. And he said what was disturbing, when you walked, the chandeliers would sway. The ceiling was bowing. Remember, the White House had burned August 24th, 1814, and then it had a subsequent fire. And they built a third floor on those old wooden beams. Were long overdue. Truman was worried the building was going to crash. He said the building's going to collapse, and of course everyone will blame me. He also said, you couldn't shut the door tight because the foundation had shifted. So this haunted, ghost-ridden White House, Truman's trying to build support to get the funding to completely gut, renovate, restore the building, but he can't do it. So he invites the architect of the Capitol, key members of Congress, and others, and he brings them to the White House. He wants to show them how the chandelier shakes and everything. And he didn't set this up. This is just one of the great coincidences in history. As they're walking in the White House, there on the floor is a pile of debris and rubble. And everybody looks at it. What is this pile of construction rubble doing on the floor of the White House? So they look up, and the piano leg of Truman's piano is sticking through the ceiling. Oh my God. And then he delivered the great line. He said, this building is standing purely by habit. So he got enough funding and they gutted the White House, and he got to oversee this historic restoration. And he made darn sure it was done with great historical integrity. He wanted the whole building restored back to around circa 1820, that French Empire style under James Monroe, which was the renovation reconstruction after it was burned in the War of 1812. So Truman does more than that. He plays an active role in it. In fact, the construction crew and the foreman had to contact Truman's aides and say, would you please keep the president away from here? He would show up every day barking orders to the crew, grabbing a hammer. And they're like, look, we got this, Mr. President. But he was so keen on making sure it was an accurate historic renovation. He also drove them nuts because, whenever there's a big construction project like that Addison Reserve or something, they put the big sign up and announce the name of the company, the contractor, during the renovation. Truman saw the sign and blew a gasket. He said, no, this is the people's house. This is the White House. You don't put a sign up on it. It cheapens the house. He made him take the sign down. So it's during this restoration that they dig the multiple layers of basements that are now in the White House, reaffirm the third floor, put steel girders in instead of the old wood, complete renovation and reconstruction. But Truman did not want to lose the original walls of the building. So he tells them, you've got to do this and keep the original walls. The problem is, how do you bring a backhoe and a bulldozer inside when you can't knock the walls down? He said, what you're going to do is you're going to disassemble the bulldozer and big construction equipment, screw by screw, bolt by bolt, nut by nut, and carry them through the door. And then inside, you're going to reassemble the bulldozer and all the equipment. He made him do that to preserve the integrity of the walls of the building, that connection back to George Washington when he hired the architect and oversaw the initial construction of the building. So Truman got to play historian and architect. He added one feature that wasn't historically original. He added the Truman Balcony, right? Everybody remembers that. He felt that the columns on the one side of the building, where it was asymmetrical. too high, and the sun would come pounding through there, and it was yellowing the carpet and drapery and whatnot. He said, so for symmetry and also for shade, he thought, and the view was spectacular. He loved balconies. He said that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington loved balconies, so he had the Truman Balcony put in. His critics had a field day with it. They called him Back Porch Harry. Harry who? To err is Truman. What's interesting about it is the White House Historical Association has asked all the presidents since then, starting with Eisenhower, about the rooms that they liked the most in the White House. Many of the presidents since then have cited the Truman Balcony as one of their favorite places in the building. He also got to be a military officer, and then I'll give you my 10 stories. So he didn't get to go to West Point, which he always wanted to do. Unfortunately, he was from a poor family and had no connections. But World War I. Truman's a little older than most everyone, but he gets a chance in World War I, and he distinguishes himself, becomes a captain, Battery D of the Missouri National Guard, their artillery. So he becomes an artillery captain in the war. Now, the problem for Truman was this. He wore glasses and could barely see. He had really bad eyesight. So he has to pass the eye exam, right, everyone? Pass the eye exam. So the problem is Truman can't, he said, wherever I went in, I couldn't even see the eye chart. How am I going to pass it? So what he did was, one thing is when he went in the war, he put extra glasses in every pocket and his rucksack. He had so many extra glasses, so if something happened to his glasses, he could see and fight the war. Now, here's one thing about Truman, which I think is remarkable. And Abraham Lincoln shared this, and Alexander Hamilton shared this. A few of my heroes from history, Ben Franklin, they were all photographic in terms of their memory. Truman had a photographic memory, just remarkable. So here's what he does. He has to go take the eye exam. There's a couple of 2 or so other young guys, and he tells them, look, why don't you boys go first? So they walk into the eye exam. Truman's standing outside the door. He listens, and when they read the eye chart, he memorizes the entire eye chart. Then he walks in. He says, I could barely see the wall. And when the doctor asked him to read the eye chart, he just memorized and said the entire thing and passed it. So he got to go in World War I. He was in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, distinguished himself as a hero, saw men die, killed men. So he was a soldier's officer and a military man's president. Had great respect for those in uniform and for the horrors of war, because he had tasted it firsthand during World War I. Okay, so are you ready for 10 fun stories? Everybody ready? Okay, all right, story number 1. One of the people I interviewed was one of Truman's secretaries. Her name was Wanda, and I found her in Sarasota. Drove over and she made me a cake and wore all these Truman buttons. So I interviewed her at length and taped it. And I wanted to put her at ease, and because I wanted these interviews to be conversational, like we're sitting across the dinner table, like us right now, just having a casual conversation. So I told her while we were getting ready for the interviews, I said, tell me one of your favorite memories of Harry. He and I are on a first name basis, by the way. So she says, she goes, here's one. She goes, there were about 4 secretaries and we worked in a little cluster. They did all the typing and phones and whatever. So she wasn't his personal secretary or his scheduler. She was one of a pool of secretaries outside the president's office. She says, one day he comes walking by and she said, I put a photograph on my desk of my son. I can't remember the son's name, but let's say it was John. She says, I put that photo there. Truman comes walking by. He had no business with me whatsoever. But as he walks by, I hear him say, Wanda. And she said, first off, I couldn't believe he knew my name. Secondly, he says, is that a new photograph on your desk? And she says, yes, Mr. President. He says, well, who is it? She said, it's my son, John. He goes, wow, what a handsome boy. How old is John? She said, he's 8. Well, he's not 8. He's 7. He'll be 8 in about 8 weeks on, July 30th or whatever. And then Truman walked into the office. She said, I almost fell out of my chair. I couldn't believe the president knew my name, noticed the photograph, and cared enough to talk to me and ask about my son. You should know that everybody I interviewed said that Truman knew the name of everyone that worked for him. And he insisted on meeting everyone and treating everyone with great dignity and respect. So you know where I'm going with this story, don't you? Yep. 8 weeks later, Truman comes walking by with a gaggle of aides. He comes walking by, and Wanda, it's the day of her son's birthday. She says, the president stops and goes, Wanda, isn't today John's birthday? And she says, yes, Mr. President. He said, well, tell him I said happy birthday. And then he laughed and went in his office. Can you imagine? Remarkable. She said, now I like Ike. I like Eisenhower too, but she said, I worked for Eisenhower, and she said it was so shocking for all of us because this military guy comes in and says, listen, when you're working for Eisenhower, you are not to speak to him. You are not to look at him. You are to avert your eyes. So if you're in the hallway, you stand with your back against the hallway. If you're in a staircase or elevator, you get out and look at your feet when the president's around. She said, we were used to working for someone that said, call me Harry. So there you go. Story number 2. Truman lived at 219 North Delaware Street in Independence, Missouri. And a man, his car breaks down. This is shortly after Truman's presidency. His car breaks down, so he goes and knocks on the Truman door, not knowing who lived there, and he wants to borrow the phone to call a tow truck. So Truman lets him in to use the phone. The man has no idea who Truman is. The man uses the phone, calls a tow truck. Truman then says, look, it'll be a little while. Why don't we have an iced tea or something? He invites the man to sit down and rest. And then when it's been a little while, the man says, look, you've been more than gracious. I should be going. So as the man's leaving to go back out to his car, he's walking down the front steps and walkway. And Truman walks out onto the porch and is saying goodbye. The man turns around and looks at him and says, you know, has anyone ever told you, you look a lot like that son of a bitch, Harry Truman? And Truman says, yeah, I get that all the time. So what happens is later on, at some point later, the man realized, oh my goodness, that was actually the president. So he wrote a letter to the library apologizing. So I've had a couple of aides and archivists and librarians tell me that one and show me the letter. So story number 3, similar kind of story. There was a couple and they got married and they were doing, on their honeymoon, they were, riding across like Route 66, one of these Americana tours, stopping at various, folksy places across the country, sort of like places Chevy Chase would have gone to in the movie Vacation, right? So they're driving across the country. They stop at Truman's home. And it's shocking for us today to even think of this. Today the president's house would have a fence or wall. There would be motion detector lights. There would be cameras, Secret Service, none of that. The lady said we stopped and we got up and we just walked up to his house. She gave the camera to her husband and she was pretending that she was going in the house on his front porch and the husband was going to take some photographs. And she said to her horror, the door opened and there stands the president of the United States. She said, we thought we were going to be arrested and put in some secret prison or something. Instead, Truman walks out and says, here, hand me the camera. And then he has them like sit on his swing in his front porch and sit on the bench, pretend they're going in the house, and he's taking photographs of them. Then he gives them the camera and, as they drive away, he's out in the front yard waving goodbye, the president of the United States. So she said, we were so excited to develop the film because, what a story. And she says, unfortunately, here it turns out Truman never took photographs. He was a lousy photographer. He cuts their heads off on almost all the photos. But my God, they had a good story, right? Story number 4. You would agree with me that one of the great scourges of American politics is campaign finance. Our politicians are what? Bought and paid for, right? Campaign finance. I've been saying, you all have heard me say this, I've said this my entire 30-year career, that we need to begin to call campaign finance what it really is, and that's legalized bribery. So in 1948, Truman is running against Mr. Dewey. Now, no one is old enough to remember 1948, or no one's probably ever heard of Mr. Dewey, right? So Truman's running against Dewey. Truman used to call Dewey, quote unquote, the little man on top of the wedding cake. Didn't he look like him? The pencil thin stash, little bowler, black suit. He looked like the guy on top of the wedding cake. And even though every newspaper, every poll, every expert, they all said Truman was going to lose big in 48, he kept telling his aides he was going to win. And he would laugh and say this. He would say, of course I'm going to win. He goes, who's going to vote for Dewey? He looks exactly like the villain in all the old silent movies, that the guy that ties the lady down on the train tracks, right? Didn't he look just like that guy? Sure he did. And I'm glad you know that, because my students have no idea what I'm talking about if I say Dewey or silent movies and whatnot. So Truman is losing big, and his aides are worried. So here's the concern. Not only is he going to lose, he's going to lose so big that he's going to drag down the Democratic Party with him. In 1946, 2 years earlier, in that midterm election, the Democrats lost 50-some seats in the House, which was blamed on Truman. So they were worried. They said, Mr. President, you're not only going to lose, you're going to lose big, you're going to drag the Democratic Party down with you and your legacy. We have to start thinking about your legacy. So what they're doing is they're trying to set up some fundraisers so Truman has more money, so at least he can run competitively. Truman doesn't want to go to the fundraisers. He's too busy governing. He sees fundraising as cheapening and selling the office. I mean, that's almost quaint by today's perspective, isn't it, everyone? When politicians are just money grubbing. So the aides are trying to get him to go to a $5,000 fundraiser, and he won't go. At one point, the aides become so frustrated, they say to him, Mr. President, you don't understand. It's $5,000 and you're going to lose. Truman says to them, no, it's not $5,000. You don't understand. What it is, if I win, it's 5,000 IOUs, and I'm not for sale. And he didn't go. I'm quite certain that that was the last time any elected official ever said such a thing. And of course, the wonderful outcome here of the story is Truman manages to win in 48. So you can do the right thing and still win. Story number 5, sticking with the 48 campaign. So Dewey was way ahead, but Truman pulls off one of the bigger upsets in history. How does he do it? How does this happen? One, Dewey gets very, very lazy. He's so overconfident, he's barely campaigning, maybe one campaign stop a day. Truman, on the other hand, is doing 5, 10, 20, 30. He's basically crisscrossing the country on his train, the Ferdinand Magellan, giving speeches to every little backwater community of 50, 100 people, one-stop sign towns, people that have never met a president before. Truman puts enough miles to go to the moon and back, and he's hitting that stump part. Here's a line from one of the Dewey speeches, just to give you an idea of how overconfident and vacuous his campaign had become. He says, that which is behind us is the past, and that which is before us, what? Is the future. What is that? Truman, on the other hand, crisscrosses the country, speaking honestly to everyone. I had the pleasure of interviewing 2 of Truman's speechwriters who told me about the 48 campaign and the whistle stop. And here's what they said. Truman was no great orator or rhetorician like an FDR, nor did he have the gravitas of Eisenhower, who had been Supreme Allied Commander. Truman was a failed farmer that didn't have a very good speaking voice. He was average height and built, and he wasn't charismatic. But here's what he did. Truman talked to people in a way that was so honest and so memorable and so direct. So he had his aides go in advance of his train to all these little towns across the country. And here's what he told them to find out. Find out what's the crop that they're growing in this town. Corn, wheat, pears, pumpkins, apples, squash. What is it? How's the harvest? Because it's fall, right? How is the harvest? How much are they getting per bushel? How is the weather during the farming season? He's a farmer. People are farmers. He's going to talk to them in a language they can understand. Number 2, what's the local high school football team's record? This is what matters to people, right? Number 3, every little town has a Revolutionary War, Civil War, or World War II soldier and statue in the downtown square. He told the aide, a hometown hero. He told the aides, find out who that is, who's on the statue, and I want to know their story. So remember, he has a photographic memory. So Truman goes to these little backwater towns. People had never met a president before, and here he comes on his train with the flags flying. Now, Truman's pushing statehood for Israel, a massive Jewish immigration. He's pushing civil rights legislation. He's pushing women's legislation. He's pushing universal health care. He has no business winning in the heartland or the Bible Belt, none at all. But what he says to folks is, listen, what I'm about to tell you, you're not going to agree with and you're not going to like. But I ask that you refrain from booing me until I'm done with my remarks, and then you can have at me. And he would say things like this, I heard your fall harvest was bad. I heard you're only getting, X amount of dollars per bushel when you should be getting more than that. Must have been that terrible rain on August 20th or whatever. And he would talk to them about their harvest. And people were thinking, how does this guy know this? And that's a language that people understand. And then he would tell them that he was a farmer and he understands such things. And he's going to fight for the family farms because he said, I came from one. And then he would say to them, and I want to tell you, if you vote for me, I'm going to give them hell. The same way your high school football team did last week when they beat Thomas Jefferson High 14-7. And people are thinking, how in the heck does he know about our, right? And then he would say to them, and I want you to know that I respect those who served in uniform. I served. And he would say, like your private whatever, Private Ryan, whomever the statue is in the downtown. And he would tell them that story. I honor his ultimate sacrifice. And I will remember him every day that I'm in office because I respect those who served, those who perished, POWs, etc. And then, he'd wave from the back of the train and the train would head on down to the next town. Now, how do you not vote for that guy? Am I right? People in those towns, they would remember him for the rest of their lives. And he pulls off the upset and wins. Here's one other cute story about that Ferdinand Magellan, his campaign train. One of the speechwriters, his name was Dr. Ken Heckler, Hechler. He was a Ivy League professor before he worked for Roosevelt and Truman. And he told me that what he would do is Truman loved it when people would yell, "Give him hell, Harry." And he would say, "I'm not giving him hell, I'm just telling the truth, but they think it sounds like hell." So Truman loved it when people would yell, "Give him hell, Harry." So what Dr. Heckler would do is he would sneak off the train and go out into the audience. And when Truman got to a signature point in a speech, Heckler would yell, "Give him hell, Harry." And then the whole crowd would start yelling. Dr. Heckler said one day he was out there and he started in, "Give him hell, Harry." And he didn't realize, but next to him were some members of the National Press Corps. And they go, "Hey, weren't you that guy that was at the last several stops yelling, 'Give him hell, Harry'?" So he was almost caught. So I said, "Dr. Heckler, what'd you do?" He said, "When the train started to leave, I ducked through the crowd and ran like hell." He said, "I ran and jumped on the train like in some cowboy movie or something." And he said, "I went to see Truman and Bess and Margaret and tell them this story. And they weren't mad. They just laughed. And they said, we must be the only campaign that brings along our own heckler." So that's story number, 5. Story number 6. So I said a moment ago, Truman was the last president to lack a college degree, but he was a voracious reader, a real bibliophile. He claims to have read every book in his high school library. Truman just read and read and read. One of his favorite sayings, by the way, was this. He would always say, quote unquote, "The only thing new in this world is the history that you haven't read yet." He would tell his aides that whenever he had to make a great decision, he would read all the classics and read all about it and immerse himself in the issue so that he knew it front, back, and so on. How could a failed, poorly traveled farmer who lacked a college degree be the architect of NATO and the Marshall Plan and the post-war order? It's remarkable. So here's a story. One of the aides tells me that one day they got a message to go to the president's office, and the president was supposed to give a major radio speech in, 45 minutes or an hour. So the aide was summoned because the aide's job was to have the president read the speech to practice it so that he didn't flub it when it's time to give the speech. So the aide goes in and sees the president. The aide tells me, he says, usually Truman would call out your name and say something funny and warm. But he said this time Truman's sitting there and he has his head in a book. And it's a giant, thick book, and his head's in it. And the aide says Truman just sits there reading. When he finishes the paragraph or chapter or whatever he finished, he finally shuts it and looks at the aide. And the aide says, "Mr. President, with all due respect, you're supposed to practice your radio address." And the aide says, Truman says, "That's just a speech on the radio. Now this is history." And Truman was reading a book on Charlemagne. And Truman tells the aide, he says, this is leadership. And the aide said for the next, however long they were there, rather than practice his speech, Truman gave him European history from a Charlemagnean perspective, picking out all the nuggets of leadership that he might use, of course, with Europe in the post-war order. Not bad for a failed farmer, reading Charlemagne. Truman had one child, his daughter, Margaret, and she had 4 boys. The oldest is Clifton, Truman Daniel, and he and I have been friends for, goodness, about 20 years, I guess. Every winter, I bring him down to South Florida, and he does talks all around the area. We served together on the foundation board, Truman Foundation, and we do an annual Harry Truman event every year. At any rate, Clifton told me a cute story about his grandpa being a voracious reader. He says after Truman's presidency, Grandpa and Grandma, Harry and Bess, came to visit Margaret and her boys at her Manhattan studio. And it was a Saturday morning, and Clifton said, my brother and I, they're about 6 and 4. He said, we get up and we're sneaking down the steps because we want to watch the Saturday morning cartoons. But we knew Grandpa would be up. Truman got up every day at 5 a.m. He was on military time. And sure enough, when they sneaked down the steps, Truman's sitting there reading the newspaper. So the boys say, he's got the newspaper in front of him, so we're going to sneak past him and go into the other room and watch cartoons. Right when they're walking by, they hear the president, Truman, say, you don't want to do that. You don't want to go watch cartoons. You should be reading. So he invites the boys over, sits one on each leg, and he's sitting there reading to them. A few minutes later, Margaret comes down the steps and yells at her father, yells at Harry, what are you doing? These are little boys. They want to watch cartoons. Truman was reading Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War, to these kids on a Saturday morning. This guy was a heavy and serious reader. So there you go. Story number 7. You probably have heard of the Truman Committee, sometimes called the Truman Commission. One of the key constitutional functions for the legislature is oversight. And during World War II, we're spending billions and billions of dollars. So we need congressional oversight to make sure it's being spent properly. Today we're spending an awful lot of money on this economic recovery in the COVID situation. We ought to have some more congressional oversight to make sure it's working and being spent the right way. So Truman is dogged. He creates the Truman Committee and investigates cost overruns. Truman conducts hundreds of hearings, has over 1,000 people testify. It's estimated that he ended up saving the military, get this, 10 to 15 billion, that's with a B, $billion. Hell, 15 billion, that's the price tag of the Marshall Plan, right? What he is he's dogged. He makes sure that any defense contractor, that those guns, tanks, planes are properly delivered to our men in uniform. The men in uniform are getting food. They're getting what they need to win the war. The public is getting relief, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll be damned if he didn't do it. So he was vigilant about that. So here's a story about the Truman Committee. One of the aides tells me that he also got a call from the secretary saying, you need to go to the president's office right away. So the aide runs to the president's office. He gets there, and outside of the office, there's a group of very distinguished, 3-piece suit, very angry-looking men sitting there waiting to see the president. So the aide says to the secretaries, he says, listen, I don't have a meeting with the president. I don't know what he wants, but these men look really important and really angry. So you can let them go first, and then I'll meet. And the secretary says, nope, the president was crystal clear. He wants to talk to you now. So the aide walks in and says, Mr. President, before we begin, I need to tell you there's a group of really distinguished, really angry men out there. Truman says, relax, have a seat. Let me tell you about those very angry, very distinguished looking men out there. He says, that's the board of Chase Bank. And he said, during World War II, with the Truman Committee, he said, I was investigating and corralling these cost overruns, gold plating of contracts. Companies were making incredible money, ripping us off while our soldiers in uniform were fighting and dying. And Truman was really aggressive. Yeah, okay, I get a question here, discuss dispute with MacArthur. You got it, Irwin. I'll add that one to you for the list. So Truman says to the aide, he says, you know, as bad as politics is, there's one political sin that is unforgivable, and that is wartime profiteering. When they're making money off of our soldiers in uniform, he says that is a one-way ticket to hell. So Truman was relentless in prosecuting this, saved the country money. So Truman tells the aide, he says, you know, one of the organizations that was ripping us off was Chase Bank. They were making money off the war and they weren't being honest. He says, so I went to New York City as a senator to see them. He goes, you know what? They made me sit outside of their office for 1 hour. So he tells the aide, he says, get comfortable because those sons of bitches have another 60 minutes to sit there. He made them sit over an hour. And then he tells the aide, he goes, hang on, you're going to like to see this. He calls the board of Chase Bank in and he reams them by reminding them what it means to make money while our soldiers are fighting and dying. And he told them, you made me wait an hour, so I made you wait longer. So that was Harry Truman. Next, you know what, let me do MacArthur. Let's do MacArthur. I had a request on it. So everybody knows about about MacArthur, you know, top of his class from West Point, straight from central casting, looked the role. Now, having said that, those of you that know me know I've always said MacArthur is one of the most overrated Americans in history. So here you go. Truman has a dust up with MacArthur, and he fires him in April of 1951 during the Korean War, right? The big dispute that was asked about by Irwin. So here's what happens. In the Korean Peninsula, you know, the Korean Peninsula, think of the state of Florida Peninsula, similar look. The communists push the Koreans all the way to the bottom of the peninsula. They're ready to drive them into the sea. The Koreans are facing almost a Dunkirk-like evacuation. Y'all know Dunkirk, World War II. So MacArthur is sent over to reinforce the Koreans and help to push the communists out. Now, his initial landing was brilliant. Think of Florida, so as the Korean Peninsula. They're pushed all the way down to, you know, Miami. Instead of landing in Miami and pushing them back, MacArthur lands on the inward side, the land side, closer to China. It would be like in Florida, Fort Myers or something. He comes down in a pincer move and wipes out the communists. Then he drives them up the peninsula all the way to, you know, where the 38th parallel would be, which is the waist belt, the dividing line between North and South Korea. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and Truman tell MacArthur, do not go that way. He goes. Then they say, do not go to Pyongyang. He goes. Then they tell him, do not go to the Yalu River. For a third time, MacArthur violates a direct order from his commander-in-chief and the Joint Chiefs. Think of the panhandle of Florida. The Yalu River separates the Korean Peninsula from China. If MacArthur goes to the Yalu, he's going to bring China in, and we have World War III. MacArthur, of course, goes there, and 300,000 Chinese enter the fight. MacArthur's army suffers thousands of casualties in the first 72 hours and is pushed all the way back down to the bottom of the peninsula where they began. So his own ego and refusing direct orders during a time of war from his commander-in-chief cost him. Now, here's the thing. Truman says to his aides, I have to fire MacArthur. We have to reassert civilian control over the military. But what MacArthur does is he starts bad-mouthing Truman and the Joint Chiefs. The Joint Chiefs and Truman give MacArthur a zip-it order, gag order. Stop talking to the press like this. You can't bad-mouth your president in the middle of a war. MacArthur continues. Then MacArthur asks for battlefield control of our atomic arsenal. Irwin, could you imagine this? This is shocking. There's no way in anyone's book you would give a general control of the atomic arsenal. You're not strategic, but tactical battlefield. So Truman says, that's it, I have to fire Mac. The aides say, don't do it, because MacArthur's beloved and you're despised. You'll lose too much political capital. The aides say, why don't you let the Joint Chiefs fire him? Truman says, I would never have a man in uniform do something that I wouldn't do myself. They say, well, why don't you have the Joint Chiefs stand behind you when you're firing? He says, I would never use a man in uniform as a prop, like all politicians do these days. Truman says, I'll fire him. So he goes to fire MacArthur. He goes to Wake Island, right, Irwin? Right, everyone? Wake Island. MacArthur disrespects Truman by not wearing his tie. He's not in dress uniform to meet his commander in chief during a war. This is unheard of, unheard of. So Truman ends up having to fire him. Truman goes down to 22, 23% approval. This is, everybody, the lowest approval in the history of approval ratings. The first poll done of presidential approval was done in the year 1933 by George Gallup. From 33 until today, the person with the lowest approval was not Nixon, not Carter, not Trump. It was Truman after firing MacArthur. So Truman is toast. So here's the thing now. This is what's cool. I interviewed an aide who was the point person on the firing of MacArthur. And here's the story he told me. He said, Truman called me to his office around 4:30 one day and says, I have a job for you. I need you to go to the Library of Congress and look up every book you can find on how President Lincoln fired General George McClellan during the Civil War. And then Truman starts naming all the books. Go read Carl Sandburg, read this, read that. And the aide's thinking, how the hell does Truman know the name of all the important books? So the aide says, yes, sir, Mr. President. When do you need this report? And Truman says, 5:30 tomorrow. 5:30 in the morning the next day. So you better get going. So the aide goes to the Library of Congress and looks up all the books. Here's something cute for you. This makes the story even better. You couldn't do it today because the Library of Congress has alarm systems and security and cameras. The aide says he's up in the stacks with all these books, and the Library of Congress is closing and turning off the lights, and he's not done yet. So what he does is he hides in the stacks, and get this, he runs out of the building in the middle of the night stealing the books. He told me he took them back, though. I mean, you couldn't do that today. So he works all night. In the morning, he goes and gives Truman the report on how President Lincoln fired General McClellan. And check this out. This is when Bob is asking about Bess. I'll get on that, Bob. Good, thank you. So here's what the aide says. He gives Truman his report on how Lincoln fired McClellan. And he says, why did you want this? Truman says, come with me. So before he announces to the press, he tells his staff, and here's what he tells them. He says, everyone, General McClellan did not listen to his commander-in-chief during the war. He thought his commander-in-chief, Lincoln, was a Midwestern clod who lacked military experience. He, McClellan, should be running the war because he, McClellan, wanted to be the next president. But Lincoln knew that McClellan was a peacock, so he fired him. Then he says this, ladies and gentlemen, he goes, General MacArthur doesn't listen to his commander during the war. He thinks his commander is a Midwestern clod who lacks military experience. He thinks he should be running the war because MacArthur thinks he's going to be the next president, but he's a peacock and I'm firing him. What a brilliant analogy, right, everyone? Truman put his finger on just a perfect historical analogy, putting himself on par with Lincoln. It really didn't do much good for him because he went to the toilets in the approval polls. You all remember MacArthur was given one of the largest ticker tape parades in history in New York City, right? My students, by the way, have no idea what a ticker tape parade is. Then MacArthur was invited to speak to Congress. And he gave what is one of the most famous speeches in Congress. Personally, I think it was one of the dumbest. Read it sometime. It doesn't make sense. What's MacArthur's signature line? Old soldiers never die. They just what? Fade away. I mean, what is that? That's not a good line. So people went nuts. Now, the Republicans were crying. They knew that MacArthur was the next president. One Republican said to the media, he said, today we have heard from God. Wow. So the press went to Truman to screw with him and they said, did you hear about this? And this is Truman's response. He goes, yeah. He said, I heard there wasn't a dry eye among the Republicans or a dry seat among the Democrats. He says, but I don't worry. He says, the people will see the wisdom in firing MacArthur. And you know what? It was the right thing to do. Today, you cannot find a single serious historian that would agree with MacArthur. Everybody agrees that Truman had to exert civilian control over the military. Good one, huh? Okay, I have another one here. Someone asked about Bess being an anti-Semite. I'm not going to say she was, but I'm sure as hell not going to defend her. As much as I've liked Harry, I've never liked Bess. Bess had some nasty views. Bess's family, the Wallaces, her mother, Madge, was a bitter racist and anti-Semite. And Harry Truman, gentlemen, Harry Truman had the misfortune of having a mother-in-law who lived a long life. So yeah, Bess's views were not something I'm proud of. And as much as I love Harry, I always tell everybody, if there's a heaven, I know Harry's there, and I hope I make it and want to see him. I don't know if Bess made it, but if she is, I don't want to see her. So Harry was quite something, but he loved her wildly. You know, she disagreed with him on so many decisions, including statehood for Israel. I mean, here's a man who puts his presidency on the line in an election year, 48, when he knows he needs to carry the Bible Belt. And what does he do? He pushes for over 390,000 refugees from the Holocaust, from DP camps to come into the country. He pushes a $100 million loan guarantee for Israel. Truman supports Israel's most favored nation trading status when the whole world, as you remember, 48 and 49 were boycotting. No one would sell to or buy from Israel. And Bess didn't agree with any of this, but Harry did it. But yet he couldn't stand up to his wife. He loved her. I suppose love is blind, right, everyone? Well, no, you guys wouldn't know that. So love is blind. He was wild about her. He wrote her the most tender letters his whole life. You're more beautiful to me now than the day we met. I'll always remember the blonde curls and sparkling blue eyes. He was wild about her, absolutely wild. He wrote her some hot and heavy letters. In fact, there's a cute story on that. Late in life, Harry walks into the living room, and Bess is sitting in front of the fireplace with a shoebox full of letters, and she's reading them. And he stops and doesn't say anything. He kind of hides around the corner, peeking and watching her read. He's taking in this tender moment. Then, to his horror, Bess throws the letters in the fireplace. And Harry yells, "Bess, by God, think of history." And she says, "I am." So the letters that survive were really warm from him. I can't imagine how hot and juicy those love letters during World War I were that she threw away. I had another question about Truman driving home. Lockdowns. Okay. So I have a question about Trump. I have one about the A-bomb. And I have a question about Truman driving home. So Truman finished his presidency on January 20th, 1953. And he's depressed because he's despised. Newspapers are saying, good riddance. A lot of his aides were resigning. Eisenhower and Mamie stiffed Harry. There's that custom where the outgoing president treats the incoming president with great dignity, gives them a tour of the White House. Bush 1 was magnanimous with Clinton. Clinton was magnanimous with W. W was magnanimous with Obama. Obama was magnanimous with Trump. I kind of think the trend's going to stop. But so the outgoing president shows great honor to the incoming president. Truman gave the staff off, and he and Bess had scones, tea, and whatever. And Ike and Mamie sat out in the car and wouldn't come in to meet with them and have lunch and for the tour on the day of the inaugural. So Truman is depressed. He literally is carrying his own suitcase, and they're going home. The aides, some of the aides said, and one of them I interviewed, said that Truman was depressed. Nobody liked him. All the great things he had done. Think of it, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, NATO, expanding Social Security, expanding veterans benefits, statehood for Israel, all the amazing things, civil rights, women's rights, all these amazing things he had done. The aides said that they were literally walking together, and Truman was all bummed. What's interesting is the one thing the aides said that really got a response from Truman was the DPs, the displaced persons. The aide was saying, "Mr. President," they all were saying, if it wasn't for you, we would have had World War III, thanks to the, Berlin Airlift. The Marshall Plan saved European civilization. Mr. President, you had the first civil rights laws. Mr. President, but Truman's depressed. Then they say, "Mr. President, thanks to you, thousands of survivors of the Holocaust uh, are alive and were able to come to this country. And Truman asks them, he finally says something, how many? And they say over 390,000. And Truman says, it's not enough. I could have done more. Wow. No, he couldn't. Here's why. We had immigration quotas, everybody. Each country had a specific number of people that could come in. The problem for refugees, Jewish refugees, was twofold. One, they didn't have a country. Many would not go back to Germany or Poland or Russia, and who could blame them? I wouldn't. So if they didn't go back, they don't have a country that they can be brought in on. Two, the American public, the Congress, the Joint Chiefs, everybody was anti-Semitic. So here's what Truman does. One of his most senior aides, whom I interviewed a few times, his name was George Elsey. He and Clark Clifford were the point people on statehood for Israel. George Elsey also wrote the first draft of the Truman Doctrine, everyone. So I got a chance to interview him, and he told me Truman should have been impeached for what he did for Israel. And I said, tell me why. He said, here's why. Because there was immigration quotas, and Holocaust survivors in the DP camps couldn't get into the country. So Truman tells his aides to do this. Let's say there was a quota to bring 1,000 Greeks in, but only 500 Greeks came in. Truman would say, list 500 DPs in Cyprus as Greek and bring them in. This is the lengths that he went to save lives from 45 to 53. And if the country had found this out, he could have been impeached for violating the law. Okay, someone else asked about the atomic bomb. Let me say that one, and then I'll bring this to a close. The atomic bomb. Truman drops the bomb. I had the pleasure of interviewing aides that were with Truman, national security aides, including one who was with him at Potsdam. It was during that Big Three meeting when Truman ordered that the bomb be dropped. Now, the public did not know this, but we had cracked the Japanese code. Today, all scholars know this. It's been declassified. You can go to the National Archives or the Truman Library and file a Freedom of Information Act request and get access to all this. I've read it. Truman couldn't tell the public that we had cracked the Japanese code, or the Japanese would have changed their encryption. But conventional wisdom was that Japan did not have any planes left. So the thought was we could anchor hundreds of ships off the Japanese coast and bring tens of thousands of men ashore. No, because the Japanese actually had airplanes left. Sharon says, thank you, Sharon, appreciate that. The Japanese had airplanes left with just enough gas to get airborne, and one bomb and a kamikaze pilot. Now, you could be the best anti-aircraft gun machine gunner, but if there's a kamikaze plane who's bound and determined to run into you, there's nothing you can do about that. Could you imagine, everyone, hundreds of ships off the coast of Japan, and all of a sudden scrambling from nowhere, kamikaze pilots come in? That would have been a bloodbath. Truman also found out, and this is declassified too, the Japanese were planning some of the first suicide bombers in this respect. Young boys, Japanese boys, were given a hand grenade, and they were told, don't throw the hand grenade because you could miss and forget to pull the pin out. Instead, lie down in front of a tank tire, a truck tire, or walk up to Americans and pull the pin. This is what they were teaching in Japan, that kind of fanaticism. Women were told, when American soldiers come up, thanks, Sherry, when American soldiers come up, to get a sharpened piece of bamboo and stab them right where the rib cage opens up. You know, if we had invaded Japan, everyone, it would have been a city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street, house by house, room by room bloodbath. Remember, everyone, this war cost at least 60 million lives, 60 million lives. And it lasted for years. North Africa, Europe, parts of the Pacific, Asia were in ruin. This is the world's worst conflict. We needed to rebuild and get this thing over. So Truman ordered the atomic bomb to be dropped. He ordered that we leaflet. In other words, give warnings to Japan. Tell your leaders to surrender, get out of your cities, that kind of a thing. So he ordered that we leaflet, drop the bomb. Then he gave Japan 3 days. He wanted to give them long enough. Somebody asked the question. Oh, Stephen says, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. He wanted to give Japan 3 days before they Oh, and Daniel asked a question about driving home. I'll jump on that. 3 days before he hits them with another bomb, he gave them enough time to digest the horrors. We leafleted again. The response from Japan was basically F you. So Truman said Japan made the decision, hit him again. Now, we only had 2 bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy, perhaps named for Truman and Churchill and Truman. But Truman played poker with Japan, indicating that he would hit him again and again and again. Everyone, this is the most difficult decision anyone's had to ever make in history. But Truman made, I think, the right decision. The proof is in the pudding. How many Americans died by dropping the bomb? 0. How many Americans would have died in an invasion? They were talking about 250,000 casualties, everybody, and millions of Japanese. So 0 and 250,000 Japanese, or 250,000 Americans and millions of Japanese. Tough decision, but the proof is in the pudding there. About Truman going home, there's a cute story. When Truman arrives in Independence, back home, he was so unpopular that he didn't think anybody would come out to see him. Now, it wasn't a giant crowd and a giant reception, but there were people and there was a celebration. And he almost teared up. He said to his wife, he said, "I can't believe anyone's here. This is how unpopular he was." But then he tells the crowd, he goes, "You should be here. That's for all the hell and hard work." Because Truman really worked his rear end off. Let me give you one more story and a bit of advice, and I'll call this one. I asked all the aides to tell me what was the first thing Truman said to them when they met him. And I really, really like this one. That's why I saved it for last. He insisted on meeting everyone that met him. And when he did, this is what he would say. I had multiple people tell me the same darn thing. He would say to them, "You know, the big corporations all have lobbyists to help them out. The wealthy folks all have lawyers to help them out. The powerful folks, they have special interests to help them out. But the regular people in this country, the average Americans, all they have, me and you. So as long as you work for me, you had better never forget that. Are we clear?" And then when the aide would say yes, Truman would say, "Well, welcome to the team." Isn't that nice? Don't you want to work for that guy? I want to work for that guy. I often thought if I had a real job, if I managed people, that's what I would tell my workforce. You better believe it. And I'll end with just a little bit of advice, and I think this is important. I've spent 30 years now as a professor reading, writing, teaching history. I've read all the presidents. I've written on a good number of them. Actually, I've written on all of them to some extent. And I'm always looking for leadership tips and lessons from history. And here's what I found. Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon had great political skills. Nixon probably knew more about policy than almost anyone. Johnson, as you know, was the consummate politician. But yet, they were both undone by their own thin-skinnedness. Johnson and Nixon would fire you if you disagreed with them. Johnson and Nixon were so thin-skinned that they would mix up the messenger with the message. Even if you came to them with news that their polls had dropped, "You're fired. I thought you were loyal." This is how fanatical they were. Everybody had to kiss their ring. Jimmy Carter and George W. Bush, I think, both made a different kind of mistake. Carter surrounded himself with a small group of ideologues who I don't think was ready for prime time. And he only listened to the small group of ideologues and made a lot of mistakes. W surrounded himself with a small group of ideologues, very experienced, but he only listened to them. And they both made horrific mistakes as a result. Here's the difference. Truman would not fire you if you disagreed with him. He got rid of people who did not disagree with him. Because Truman knew that debate, dissent, and disagreement were vital elements for democracy. Truman would tell his aides, not only can you disagree with me, he would say, "That's an order from your commander." And Truman surrounded himself with the best of the best of the best, Democrat, Republican, all across the spectrum. And he demanded that everybody weigh in, and he would listen to them. Whenever he had to make a decision, whether it was a policy issue or a major speech, here's what he would do. He would demand that everyone disagree with him in debate. He made everyone weigh in on the issue. And then he would tell everyone, "All right, boys," he would say, "I'm going to sleep on this. and tomorrow morning I'm going to give you my decision. So he'd sleep on it. In the morning, he'd meet and he'd bring them all together and he'd ask them one question. Here's what they told me. He would say, all right, boys, now tell me, is this the right thing to do? Are we doing the right thing? So in the end analysis, it all came down to, is this the right thing to do? What a way to make decisions, right? And again, if I ever had a real job, what a way to make decisions. Surround yourself with the best of the best of the best. Demand debate, demand dissent, absorb multiple perspectives, read everything you can, and then in the end, is this the right thing to do? I mean, what a decision. So let me just check the chat room, make sure I got everybody here. Thank you, Sharon and Sherry. I got to, thank you, James and Daniel. Jim had a question for me. I'm going to write his email down and send him an email. 1 second. Jim Bojo at me.com. Jason, thank you. Stephen, thank you. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. It's a real pleasure. Be safe, everyone. And I hope to see you soon. If I can be of service, just say the word. And when things return to normal, make sure you all save me some of those delicious Addison Reserve cookies. Okay? Take care of yourself, everybody. Real pleasure. And I hope to talk to you soon. Thank you.